each and every one of you to this very important hearing on human rights in Azerbaijan since the fall of Nagorno-Karabakh. I welcome each and every one of you here today, and we want to focus on the human rights violations that have been committed by the Azerbaijani government, especially Aliyev, and to really try to get our government to do far more than it has done, and that includes all of us, both the executive branch and the congressional side, to try to mitigate the horrific, ongoing, pervasive human rights abuses committed by Baku. We have an extraordinary, distinguished panel of witnesses here today, and I will introduce them in a moment. Right now, I want to recognize that we have in the room with us today many distinguished guests, leaders of the Armenian Church, of the Armenian American Organization, supporters of Armenia. Many of these are not even Armenian, but they have a great deal of empathy and commitment to the cause of Armenia. I want to thank all of you for coming here today to consider what can be done today for Nagorno-Karabakh. Let's not forget, this is the one-year anniversary of the fall of Artsakh, and all of us grieve over what has happened in plain sight with very Armenians, I should say, remain there in Nagorno-Karabakh. But also we are concerned deeply for the political prisoners and the POWs held by the government of Azerbaijan. To protect Armenian cultural heritage remains an extremely high priority, and we want to uphold the right of return, one day to live in peace and freedom in Nagorno-Karabakh. In June and early September of last year, during the blockade of Artsakh by the armed forces of Azerbaijan, I chaired 2 congressional hearings of this commission on the blockade and developing ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenians lived for 2,500 years. One of our distinguished witnesses, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the former chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, testified, and this was the final week of the blockade, on his report, which explained how the very blockade itself, and it was an attempt to starve, to use food as a weapon, remembering what happened in Ethiopia under Mengistu, where he used food as a weapon, and that's exactly what was being done here, to starve the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that constituted, according to this distinguished chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the crime of genocide. And he made a very, very persuasive case at that hearing and elsewhere as he brought that news to the rest of the world. I immediately sent the testimony and the documentation to President Biden, and sadly, we received no response. In 2021, President Biden's recognition of the Armenian genocide of 1915, and I've also chaired several hearings on that, and bipartisan hearings, I'm happy to say. It was long overdue, but it was done, and I'm glad that happened. But we didn't do enough here. We had an opportunity to do far more, and we did not rise to that challenge. We know what happened last September. Having starved the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh right to the edge of mass famine, the government of Azerbaijan sent in its army to occupy the territory, and with a well-founded fear for their lives, the Armenians left for the Republic, many of them, those who could, for the Republic of Armenia. I want to begin by stating very clearly that the genocidal blockade, and there still needs to be an accountability for this, and I think there needs to be prosecutions, whether it be a hybrid court or the ICC or some other venue. You know, justice, there's no statute of limitations on genocide. And I think that remains a cause that we need to continue to push, to hold those who committed these crimes, including Aliyev himself, to account. Some might say, well, it's time to move on. No, it's not time to move on. The ethnic Armenians continue to have a right to live in peace and freedom in Nagorno-Karabakh according to their very, very cherished faith and traditions. They have not surrendered that. They have not lapsed. The Armenians give every sign that they are willing to live in peace. It is the government of Azerbaijan and their long record of savage genocidal threats against the Armenians that prevents them from exercising that right today. It is a long record of unspeakable and depraved atrocities committed against them, including around the 2020 war that prevents them from living in their homeland. But their right remains, and it is not abolished by this ongoing injustice. We must also defend the human rights of ethnic Armenians, who are now political prisoners themselves, or prisoners of war of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the cultural heritage, as I mentioned a moment ago. Because today is the anniversary of the fall of Nagorno-Karabakh, we will focus on the government of Azerbaijan's grave human rights abuses against ethnic Armenians. But we will remember that the ethnic Armenians, Azerbaijanis, are also suffering under the dictatorship of Aliyev. According to the Union for Freedom of Political Prisoners of Azerbaijan, there are now some 300 known ethnic Azerbaijani political prisoners in Azerbaijan. In the past year, I have advocated particularly for the release of Mr. Ibanoglu, an eminent international economist who returned to Azerbaijan last summer to visit his mom. He was jailed for his work promoting human rights and freedom in Azerbaijan and has spent 14 months, the last 14 months, either in house arrest or in prison in conditions that are life-threatening. In 2015, I met twice in Baku over the course of 2 years with Aliyev, including in 2015. And we talked for almost an hour about human rights. I pressed him hard, civilly, but hard, and we've gotten nowhere. I introduced legislation to try to hold him and his government to account, and all they did was trash it and say what nonsense it was, and we're going to do that again. We're preparing legislation again to try to hold him accountable. I appeal, however, to President Aliyev for a dramatic change. Anyone can change. He needs to change. A change for the Azerbaijanis who live under what is really one of the most repressive governments in the world, which makes almost every worst of the world list. And a change for ethnic Armenians who should be released from prison immediately and provide a dramatic gesture of reconciliation rather than warmongering. Western Azerbaijan and demands for the territory of the Republic of Armenia remains a big problem as well. Regarding our own government, I am very disappointed in the Biden administration. And I say that if this was Trump or anybody else, I say the exact same thing. I've been in Congress 44 years. When it comes to human rights, there is no partisanship. We need to be clear, unmistakable in our condemnation of human rights abuse, and always do, what if I was in that cell, or I was being tortured, or women who have been raped? We need to stand up for them, and that is bipartisan. And again, I don't care who's in the White House, we need to do far more. I'm very concerned that we did not object to the government of Azerbaijan's bid to host the COP29, a major international summit to address climate change. This will open in Baku on November 11th, as you all know. Heads of states and large delegations from around the world will be in Baku. Of course, the government of Azerbaijan is using this as an opportunity to showcase itself. Absurdly, the government that committed genocide just recently in 2023 is now posing as a peacemaker of 2024. The government is calling on all countries in conflict to observe a military truce for the duration of the COP29 conference. How touching! How weird for them to be doing that. This reminds me of the way Xi Jinping in China, and I do chair the China Commission, how he operates. He did it with the Olympics. He said there will be human rights protections, especially during the Olympics, and it was anything but. There was a massive crackdown, and people were dragged into the gulags, or the laogai of China, and horribly mistreated, and some were killed. How about a truce in the government's assault of the people who live within its own borders? And again, I ask a release of the political prisoners. We need to hold them to account. And I commit that I will work very hard to get legislation passed. Yeah, it'll run into problems in the Senate like every human rights bill does, and I've written many of them. I'm the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and 4 others that followed. The first one took 3 years, was objected to by the Senate. We finally got it. We got to get this done on behalf of the suffering people of Armenia. I'd like to announce right now that, again, we're going to introduce this Azerbaijan Democracy Act, a bill that will put U.S. policy sharply on the side of freedom, human rights, and the rule of law in Azerbaijan. We are joined by my very distinguished colleague. I'd like to yield such time as he may consume as an opening.
Thank you very much, Co-Chairman Smith, together with the co-chair McGovern, for your leadership your passion and your strong support for the people of Armenia, and your long history, as you noted, for standing up for human rights and being a very strong bipartisan support or voice as it relates to these efforts. It's fitting and appropriate, I believe, for the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission to have this hearing today as it relates to human rights in Azerbaijan since the fall of Nagorno-Karabakh, or as the Armenians like to refer to it as Artsakh. The hearing today really is an opportunity to continue to shed light on the violations and the injustices that have been taking place for years now as a result of the Azerbaijan government and its president. This week marks 1 year ago that after conducting an unjust blockade, Azerbaijan forcibly displaced over 120,000 Armenians from their historic homeland through a rapid military takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh, or as we refer to it, as Artsakh. The government of Azerbaijan must be held accountable for its crimes. These are crimes, violations of human rights. These violations involve ethnic cleansing through forced displacement and maiming and rape and other exacting of taking of lives. And therefore, Azerbaijan must be held accountable. Sadly, they still threaten Armenia. They have a post that they have located within Armenian boundaries, and they're expanding and building military barracks and widening highways that I believe threatens to impede the negotiations and the discussions on the peace process. I know that there have been conversations with Secretary Blinken, not only with the Armenian Prime Minister, but I believe most recently with the Azerbaijan president. But there are remaining obstacles that have to be resolved, and they cannot be resolved without first holding Azerbaijan accountable, in my view. So therefore, the threat of the actions by Azerbaijan directly threatens the peace process. As witnesses have noted, and Co-Chairman Smith has so eloquently stated, Freedom House recently published a thorough and authoritative report documenting Azerbaijan's human rights violations and other crimes committed against the people of Artsakh. We hold these report by the Freedom House and submit it for the record as further documentation. Without objection, thank you, Mr. Chairman Smith. As further evidence of the violations on behalf of the country of Azerbaijan to the people of Armenia and Artsakh. I want to commend the work of Chairman Smith again and Co-Chairman McGovern and all of those who are part of this effort that include the Armenian Caucus and the Armenian National Committee. I commend all of you for the work that you've done to contribute to this report. And when you read it, it lays out in stark detail, the crimes for which Azerbaijan, as we have both said, must be held accountable. To that end, I'm proud, along with many of my other colleagues, to be a co-sponsor of the Artsakh Revenue Recovery Act, led by Representative Adam Schiff. This bill would confiscate Azerbaijan assets held in the United States and set up a fund to compensate the Artsakh Armenians for the property and revenue that they've lost. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the destruction that they've taken of religious churches and other shrines within the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Destruction obviously intended to be so that the native Armenians could not return back to their homeland, their historic homeland. I think the administration needs to double up its efforts in this peace process. The efforts with USAID that now totals over some $200 million is important. It is making a difference, but I believe more needs to be done. And we must act together because this, as the Chairman Smith indicated, violations of human rights in this instance and any instance as it relates to America's ability to continue to be the beacon of light, standing up for human rights throughout the world, must be a constant. And therefore, we must continue to be on the side of Armenia and the Armenian people as we deal with this very challenging time in which Armenia is involved in. And when you look at the Minsk Accord and the agreement, I shake my head. Clearly, one of the guarantees of this accord was Russia. We know Russia, through its actions, not only in this instance, but with its invasion of Ukraine, clearly demonstrates that they cannot be trusted in any peace process. For Russia today is in my view, a syndicate masquerading as a country with a mob boss called Putin, who is a war criminal, just as the president of Azerbaijan should be held accountable for his war crimes as well. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with, and that's why America efforts and participation here must remain a constant. So this hearing today with the Tom Lantos Commission will continue, I hope, to maintain our efforts to provide the support necessary to bring justice, because that's what we're talking about here, justice for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and for the country of Armenia in this long battle that they've been engaged in. I yield back the balance of my time. And looking forward to hearing from our witnesses, Chairman Smith, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this Tom Lantos Commission. Tom Lantos, who we knew and loved and was a strong defender of human rights, just as you are, and so appropriately named after him.
Sure is. I want to thank Jim Costa for his leadership on human rights in general, but especially as it relates to Armenia. That was a very eloquent statement, and it just kind of underscores your commitment. I can't thank you enough for that leadership. It's been tremendous.
Well, I thank you for those kind words, and I smile because, as you know, and many of the people testifying in the audience, I come from the land of William Saroyan, and clearly the communities of the Armenian diaspora that have settled throughout our country remain a strong voice and a reminder of what the first genocide in the 20th century was all about. So thank you, and look forward to the hearing and the testimony this morning.
Thank you very much, Congressman Costa. We do have an extraordinarily distinguished panel of witnesses, all who bring a great deal to this commission and to the Congress and to the world with regards to these absolutely vital issues. So I'd like to now introduce them to you, and I will tell you, we will share your testimonies very, very widely with members of Congress, the leadership of both sides, and as also with the White House. We're going to get this all down to them and ask them to, really, really look at what you, the experts, are saying, and that's why a hearing like this is so important. I do hope the press will amplify your very mighty and powerful voices so that others hear it throughout not just this country, but the world. We'll begin with Garam Stepanian, I hope I got that right, Stepanian, who was the Human Rights Ombudsman of the Republic of Artsakh from March 2021 through September of last year. He has been at the forefront of documenting and exposing human rights violations perpetrated by Azerbaijan. Before that, he served as a press secretary and assistant to the Speaker of the Artsakh Parliament, and also taught at Artsakh State University. We'll then hear from Adam Smith, who is co-director of the Caucasus Heritage Watch, CHW, a forensic research and monitoring program tracking heritage destruction in the South Caucasus using high-resolution satellite imagery. He is a professor of anthropology at Cornell University and director of the Cornell Institute of Archaeology and Material Studies as well. We'll then hear from Kate Waters, who is co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, an environmental and human rights nonprofit. She is the author of numerous reports and articles on civil society in Central Asia and the Caspian and Black Sea regions, and has been interviewed for print media, radio, and television about the environment, oil, gas, and, of course, human rights. We'll then hear from Sharma Mardi, who serves as the supervising lawyer at the Center for Truth and Justice. She is involved in collecting firsthand testimonial evidence from survivors of armed conflicts, including various witnesses such as forcibly displaced persons, prisoners of war, and the families of those missing in action. We'll then hear from Van Krigorian, who serves as co-chair of the Armenian Assembly of America. He has served as chairman of the board of directors and in other positions for over 40 years. Since its founding, he has been on the board of governors, and since 2011, chairman of the academically oriented Armenian National Institute. He has also testified at some of my hearings in the past, so I welcome him back. He has always provided very, very valuable insights and wisdom. Then we'll hear from Andrea Prazov, who is the exec director of Freedom Now. She is a frequent commentator in print, radio, and TV on human rights, particularly advocating for political prisoners and people targeted by repressive governments. Prior to joining Freedom Now, she served as executive director of the Freedom Institute. And without objection, further bio on all of you will be made a part of the record. But now I'd like to ask Mr. Stefaniyan to provide his testimony. And I just want to underscore, we're not using the clock because your testimonies are so important. We don't want to limit what you have to say. So I look forward to your testimonies.
Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. In my written testimony submitted to the Commission, I have presented numerous facts and details regarding the crimes committed by Azerbaijan against the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, or as we Armenians refer to it as Artsakh. I stand before you today both as a resident of Nagorno-Karabakh who has personally witnessed and experienced the consequences of Azerbaijan's systematic genocidal policy, having been forcibly displaced from the homeland under the real threat of physical destruction, as well as an ombudsman who, due to his mission, has become a witness and documentarian of horrific crimes against humanity. When Azerbaijan blockaded the Lachin corridor in December 2022, under false ecological pretexts, I was unable to return home for 3 months. I was a human rights defender who could not go to the people whose rights I was meant to protect. 3 months later, I was able to return to Artsakh through forest roads, the roads that were extremely dangerous to travel. The real hell of the blockade was not as tangible from a distance as it was on the ground, when I saw with my own eyes the consequences of this disaster. I saw with my own eyes how people, including over 30,000 children, were living in cold conditions without gas, with frequent electricity outages and struggling to find food every day. I tried to tell the world as much as possible, hoping to break down the wall of indifference that had been created toward the fate of Artsakh people, but in vain. I have seen children looking at me with starving eyes and their suffering parents. I have seen people with chronic diseases, deprived of medicine, and the elderly and disabled struggling for daily bread. I have seen crowded bread lines and people returning home empty-handed from these lines. I have listened to Artsakh doctors who were constantly alarming about malnutrition and miscarriage among pregnant women. At the same time, I have seen people fighting for their rights every day, their only goal being to live with dignity on their own land. And gradually that hell became more terrible. On June 15, Azerbaijan completely cut off Artsakh from the outside world. Even extremely scarce humanitarian aid shipments coming to Artsakh through the ICRC were stopped at Azerbaijan's demand. Day by day, the supplies on the ground were depleted while new supplies were not being delivered. After 9 months of deliberately starving us to death, Azerbaijan attacked the people of Nagorno-Karabakh on September 19, on this very day a year ago. For 24 hours, the bombings and artillery fire did not stop. Azerbaijan was destroying everything, cutting off roads between communities, not even allowing the bodies of the dead to be transported to Stepanakert. To avoid Azerbaijani attacks, people were displaced from their homes through forest roads and tried to find shelter in Stepanakert. The streets of Stepanakert were filled with forcibly displaced people who were simply sleeping on the streets without proper food and clothing. Starting from September 24, under the real threat of physical annihilation, the entire population of Artsakh had to leave. People driven by despair and chaos were leaving their homes, not knowing what awaited them. Freedom House qualifies these events as ethnic cleansing, while the International Association of Genocide Scholars as genocide. We were forcibly displaced from our homeland in front of everyone's eyes, in front of the eyes of the Russian peacekeepers who had come to Artsakh in 2020 to ensure peace, in front of the eyes of the United States of America, which a week before the attack declared that it would not tolerate a new attack on the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, in front of the eyes of the European Union, which was negotiating so-called rights and security with Azerbaijan at the highest level, in front of the eyes of civilized humanity, which watched indifferently as the 1,000-year-old indigenous Armenian people were uprooted from Artsakh, centuries-long Armenian land, which was annexed to Azerbaijan by the decision of dictator Stalin, in front of the eyes of the UN International Court of Justice, whose decisions Azerbaijan continues to ignore, remaining unpunished. A year after the forced displacement, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh continue to live in suffering, witnessing on a daily basis how Azerbaijan is destroying our homes, leveling our communities and holy places, erasing all the remnants of Armenian trace from Artsakh, continuing to illegally detain Armenian prisoners of war and hostages, including representatives of the military political leadership of Nagorno-Karabakh. And guess what? Azerbaijan is not being held accountable for the ongoing crimes. No, surprisingly enough, it is actually allowed to organize prestigious events like COP29 in its capital. Distinguished colleagues, today the people of Nagorno-Karabakh continue to face numerous challenges. To address them, I propose the following. Ensure proper international support for forcibly displaced persons from Artsakh. The support provided by the Republic of Armenia with its limited resources is not enough to address the needs of the displaced, resulting in thousands of displaced persons living in poverty, facing numerous socio-economic problems, including housing and dignified employment. Targeted sanctions should be applied against Azerbaijan for its aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, and the war crimes committed toward them. Azerbaijan's impunity must end for the establishment of peace in the region. Peace is not possible without accountability. If Azerbaijan believes there is more to gain through war, it has absolutely no reason to agree to peace. Efforts should be made for the immediate release of Armenian prisoners of war and hostages illegally held in Azerbaijan. We are witnessing that exclusively legal tools cannot achieve results, and only strong international pressure and enforcement can force Azerbaijan to release illegally detained persons and provide information about missing persons. Comprehensive international pressure on Azerbaijan is also necessary to prevent vandalism and destruction of Armenian historical and cultural heritage in Artsakh, and the appropriation of private property by Azerbaijan. And finally, it is necessary to create a reliable international platform to address the possibilities of collective, dignified, and secure return of the people of Artsakh under international protection. The issue of the collective return of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh is currently absent from the Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiation agenda, which is unacceptable. And I think that you will agree that peace built on the broken faiths and violated rights of the thousands cannot be sustainable and long-lasting. Thank you very much.
Mr. Stepanian, thank you very much for that very detailed testimony and recommendations, all of which we will do everything we can to implement. So I thank you for that. That was very, very, very powerful. I'd like to now ask Adam Smith if you could provide your testimony to the Commission.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I will provide only a short amplification of the written remarks that were already submitted to your group.
That objection is yours, and all the others, and any extraneous materials you'd like to include will be made a part of the record.
Please. So my name is Adam Smith. I'm a co-director of Caucasus Heritage Watch, a nonpartisan research group centered at Cornell and Purdue universities. We were founded in 2020 in the wake of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War to monitor cultural heritage that the international scholarly community deemed to be at risk of damage, destruction, and cultural appropriation. What we do is we use high-resolution satellite imagery to provide regular condition assessments for hundreds of historic sites in our database. Due to their association with the region's indigenous Armenian community, and considering Azerbaijan's prior record of deliberately targeting Armenian cultural heritage on its territory, these sites are gravely endangered. At issue in their preservation is not only the fate of the region's centuries-old art and architecture, but the cultural traditions of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and their ancestral connections to this land. Now, why we monitor the heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh? The first is our job as archaeologists is to provide a voice for the irreplaceable remains of the human past. Someone must speak not only for the peoples who are involved, but also the archaeological record itself. We seek to provide an effort of archaeologists to stand against what is a rising tide of heritage abuse that stretches from the 1990s wars in Yugoslavia to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and, of course, to Nagorno-Karabakh itself. But we also want to make clear that our project is an assertion of the inalienable human right to culture. Attacks on heritage monuments are not just violence against buildings, they are violence against a people and against their collective identity. To my findings of our research group, Caucasus Heritage Watch has documented an enduring policy of the Azerbaijani government of zero tolerance for Armenian heritage. This was very clearly documented in our study of the fate of Armenian heritage in the province of Nakhichevan between 1997 and 2011, where we documented the complete expulsion, destruction, of 98% of Armenian cultural heritage sites. That was 108 out of the 110 sites we were able to assess were not just knocked down, they were wiped clean from the face of the earth, destroyed to such an extent that even archaeologists would have a very difficult time of reconstructing and finding them again. This is one of the most expansive and intensive programs of cultural erasure ever undertaken. It is also, without question, the most thorough, standing alongside Nazi destruction of synagogues in Kristallnacht and the destruction of Bosniak heritage in the wars in Yugoslavia as one of the worst examples of cultural erasure ever undertaken. So one can understand why, in 2020, the scholarly community was deeply concerned for the Armenian heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh. We have so far documented 14 destroyed sites, including historic cemeteries and churches, 12 sustained significant damage, and 31 that are at immediate threat of destruction, due mostly to the rampant and extensive development programs which use the destruction of heritage as a collateral benefit of road construction and rehabilitation. There is clearly deep concern for what is going on in Nagorno-Karabakh from the perspective of archaeologists and the historical and archaeological record. Now, what is to be done? Obviously, high-resolution satellite monitoring is quite expensive and intensive in terms of labor and human devotion to it. Our research group is stretched quite thin in terms of the ways in which it can provide regular monitoring 2 times a year using high-resolution satellite imaging. But the real need is amplification. As you've already mentioned, and as other colleagues have here too, the world community needs to be aware of the heritage destruction, and there needs to be a reputational cost for anyone, whether it's Azerbaijan or Russia or any state that undertakes to revise the historical record through the obliteration of archaeological and historical monuments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Smith. And collateral benefit, I think you just coined a word. It's just so cynical, and I thank you for it, and I'll have some questions when we get to it, but I do thank you for your testimony. Now I'd like to ask Kate Waters to provide.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm very pleased to provide testimony. My name's Kate Waters. I'm the Executive Director of Crude Accountability. which is a Virginia-based human rights and environmental NGO, and we work with communities impacted by oil and gas development. Our geographic focus includes the Caucasus, especially Azerbaijan, where we've worked closely with activists and groups on the ground since our founding in 2003. Our main area of interest is the intersection of environment, climate, and human rights in the context of oil and gas extraction, development, and transport. We do not work in Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh, so my comments today are focused solely on Azerbaijan, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the current human rights situation in the lead up to the COP29 meeting, which was already mentioned, and will be held in November in Baku. Just some brief background. I know we heard a bit of it earlier from the chairman and from others, but just to provide some context. Azerbaijan is a country of some 10 million people. Iran is to its south, the Caspian Sea is to its east, Armenia is to the west, and Georgia and Russia are to the north. It's an authoritarian country with most power in the hands of President Ilham Aliyev, who has ruled Azerbaijan since his father, who was the previous president, Haydar Aliyev, died in October 2003. The administration is rife with corruption, ranking 157 out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, a global indicator of public sector corruption. Although official statistics put the percentage of the population living below the poverty line around 5%, unofficial data posits a much higher number. As one Azerbaijani citizen told Crude Accountability, "We are the richest country, we are the poorest people." Azerbaijan is designated as not free in Freedom House's 2024 Freedom of the World report, scoring 7 of 100 possible points. On political rights, about which I'm going to speak a little bit, the country earns 0 out of 40 points, and for civil liberties, 7 out of 60. In short, Azerbaijan is far from being a democratic, free country. According to Human Rights Watch, Azerbaijan has, quote, a persistent record of using bogus charges to imprison government critics, routinely manipulating and fabricating evidence. During the past year and a half, the government of Azerbaijan has cracked down in an unprecedented crackdown on civil society activists and journalists who it perceives act or speak in opposition to the authorities, using fabricated charges, violating the rights of those who are arrested, using torture and inhumane treatment. The government of Azerbaijan blatantly arrests, mistreats, and detains those it seeks to silence. As of June of this year, the Union for Freedom of Political Prisoners in Azerbaijan stated that there are 303 political prisoners. This number represents an increase of approximately 49 individuals since last December, and we know that since June, there have been at least 2 additional politically motivated arrests in Azerbaijan. The numbers are appalling, and they represent a harsh response to civic engagement by the government of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is party to numerous international human rights treaties which recognize the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of liberty, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Azerbaijan's own constitution and its criminal code prohibit the use of torture, yet according to testimony we've received from political prisoners and according to the U.S. State Department's country report on human rights practices in Azerbaijan, multiple credible allegations of torture and other abuse continue. Most mistreatment takes place while detainees are in police custody, where the authorities repeatedly use abusive methods to coerce confessions. Authorities reportedly deny detainees timely access to family, independent lawyers, or independent medical care. These statements from the State Department correspond to the information Crude Accountability has received from family members of those arbitrarily detained during the past year. The State Department report also documents use of torture, including beatings and threats of rape. The document documents harsh prison conditions, such as cramped overcrowding, inedible food, poor sanitary facilities, inadequate ventilation, and insufficient access to medical care. There are also reports of prisoners enduring lengthy confinement periods without any opportunity for physical exercise. Reports of arbitrary detention, denial of access to a fair trial, and trial procedures themselves closely resemble the accounts Crude Accountability has heard from our Azerbaijani colleagues. In addition to the State Department's reports, there is also extensive documentation by respected human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and in my written remarks, I've included links to these really important reports, and I encourage you to read them. There are also numerous media reports on the issue. I want to focus my additional remarks today on a few of the cases, on a number of the cases of arbitrary detention and mistreatment that have taken place over the course of the last year. I don't mean to single out any one case as more important than another, but rather to provide insights into the scale of the human rights abuses taking place in Azerbaijan and the scope of the inhumane, illegal, and violent treatment of civil society and independent journalists that is occurring. Among those arbitrarily detained and imprisoned are civil society activists, academics, scholars, independent journalists, opposition leaders, and others who are inconvenient to the Azerbaijani regime. The case of my close friend and colleague, Dr. Gulbadi Badoglu, has come to the attention of Congress, and I want to thank you for the actions that you have taken on his behalf and encourage you to continue to do that. Dr. Ibadoglu, who, as was said earlier, is an economist, civil society activist, professor, and scholar who was brutally arrested in July of last year by the Azerbaijani regime. He was accused of counterfeiting money for an organization and then later charged with having religious extremist literature in his office. Both charges are absurd, but they carry a maximum sentence of 17 years of imprisonment if he is convicted. After spending 9 months in pretrial detention, suffering in unsanitary and inhumane conditions, in which he was denied access to medication needed to manage severe medical conditions, as well as only limited access to his lawyers, Ibadoglu was released to house arrest. He currently must check in with the authorities twice a week. He's not allowed to work or travel and is still separated from his family. Additionally, he is denied medical treatment to control his diabetes and his hypertension. This denial of medical treatment is severely threatening his health, causing great concern to his family and friends. And in July, his trial was indefinitely postponed, meaning he's in limbo. This is reminiscent of the indefinite postponement of another political prisoner's trial that some of you may also remember, that of Khadija Ismailova in 2015. There are other cases. Anar Mamadli, a civil society activist and human rights defender, was arrested in April of 2024. The charges against him are very similar to those against Dr. Ibadoglu. Journalists with Abzaz Media and Toplum TV have been swept up in the crackdown. A year ago, approximately, in Warsaw, Poland, at the Human Dimension Conference of the OSCE, journalists from Abzas were there reporting on it. Those same people are behind bars as I'm speaking right now. Abzas also has done very important reporting on a gold mine and on environmental concerns. These are not the only individuals arrested. Tofig Yagublu, Iqbal Abilov, Bahruz Sabmarov, and Bakhtiar Hajiev are also behind bars, as are hundreds of others who are wrongfully detained. And particularly, just my final comments here, in the lead up to COP29, this is extremely disturbing. At a time when the world's eyes are on Azerbaijan, and one might imagine that the regime had every incentive to present itself as a government that respects the rule of law, democracy, environmental protection, the Aliyev regime has doubled down on repression. Its absolute lack of respect for civil society, for independent media, for the rule of law is stunning. And yet the Azerbaijani government continues to enjoy a place in the international community, hosting COP29, engaging in trade with Europe, including in natural gas, and participating in international events and meetings. Azerbaijan's environmental record and its work to meet its climate goals are also lacking. According to the World Bank, Azerbaijan is not on track to meet its climate targets, and even as host of COP29, The country has pledged to continue its fossil fuel dependence. You may remember earlier this year when Aliyev said that natural gas and oil were a gift from God, and the massive offshore fields of Azeri Chirag, Guneshli, and Shah Deniz are being expanded rather than shrunk. A couple of recommendations. As the U.S. State Department country reports demonstrate, the U.S. government is fully aware of Azerbaijan's gross human rights record. Our engagement with the country should reflect that knowledge and include human rights front and center in dialogue with the regime. We ask that the U.S. Congress hold Azerbaijan accountable for its human rights violations. We ask that in the lead up to COP29, Congress demand that Azerbaijan immediately and unconditionally release the political prisoners who are arbitrarily and unjustly detained in Azerbaijan, including Dr. Ibadoglu, who is in desperate need of medical treatment. We ask that the U.S. Congress call for full participation by civil society at COP29, including those journalists and activists who are currently detained and imprisoned. A climate meeting without the presence and full participation of the regime's critical voices, including on corruption, climate, and fossil fuels, is not a legitimate meeting. We asked for sanctions against Azerbaijani officials who have committed human rights violations, including those included in recent global Magnitsky sanctions designations that have been provided. And finally, we ask that the U.S. Congress raise these issues publicly as well as in private diplomatic discussion, calling for justice and respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer
Thank you so very much. And pursuant to that request, we'll put together a letter, get as many members of this commission and hopefully the House to sign it, asking that all the prisoners be released prior to COP29. It's unconscionable that everyone would flock to Azerbaijan for this big conclave, this big meeting, while people are languishing and being tortured within a mile, a half mile, wherever the jails happen to be littered throughout. I just find it incredible. So we'll do that letter and we'll work on that and get that down to the president. And hopefully he will raise that issue and his administration very strongly. Thank you for those recommendations. I'd like to now recognize Sharma Mardo for her testimony.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and esteemed members of this commission, I thank you for this unique opportunity to testify before you on behalf of the victims of Nagorno-Karabakh. I am a lawyer with the Center for Truth and Justice, a human rights organization committed to collecting first-hand testimonial evidence of war crimes. We have collected over 500 testimonies from victims and eyewitnesses. The Center for Truth and Justice is ready to make our open source catalog and testimonies available for members of this commission and the United States Congress. Today, in this room are several victims. We call them warriors for justice, who have found the courage to come forward with their truth. I have the distinct privilege of telling their stories. First, I will recognize Father Hrant Hovhannisyan. For 44 days, he was surrounded by Azerbaijani troops as he held communion in Dadivank Monastery, which dates back to the 4th century. He stayed to protect the ancient church and all its artifacts and crossstones. As a result of his insistence to protect his church and people, he was placed on the terrorist list by Azerbaijan. In 2023, after being starved for 9 months under blockade, a bomb fell in his house and the father was severely injured. Only a couple of days after surgery, with stitches in his torso and back, dressed in civilian clothing, he left in a car with 4 other members of his family and 5 children to safety. Without food, water, or medicine, they traveled over 35 hours to escape Armenia. Today, despite Azerbaijan's goal of destroying all Armenian heritage and removing Armenians from their lands, he stands with his people in defense of culture, church, and religion. Next is Goharine Hovoyan. Today marks the 1-year anniversary of the bombing of her home and the death of her 16-year-old child. She is dressed in black in mourning the killing of her son. She and her 13-year-old have undergone numerous surgeries. Their bodies are still full of shrapnel. The most harrowing part of her story is the search for a coffin in the chaos of war to transport the body of her 16-year-old son to Armenia as they escaped to safety. The damage to her hand and body is so extensive that simple tasks like washing the dishes are almost impossible. But the worst pain is the loss of her son. She says, "I cried for the loss of others, but I never thought it would happen to me. May God spare all mothers of this pain, the pain of losing your child." With us is a young person whose name will not be stated here to avoid retribution from Azerbaijan. This person is the child of one of the hostages that is currently being held in dungeons of Baku without due process. In September 2023, Azerbaijan released a list of their 300 most wanted Armenians. Azerbaijani authorities illegally arrested and imprisoned members of Nagorno-Karabakh's leadership as well as civilians. Among them is the father of this person who continues to be held in Baku on fabricated allegations without due process. Prisoners cannot choose their counsel. They are not allowed visitors, and every minute of their phone calls are monitored by Azerbaijani authorities. Our young warrior has had only 2 communications with their father, who is not well. The Center for Truth and Justice interviewed 30 prisoners of war, and our findings showed that Armenians in the dungeons of Azerbaijan are subjected to prolonged physical and psychological torture and inhuman treatment. Finally, I'd like to highlight Lala Abgaryan. In September 2022, she saw her sister's image on Telegram. The footage showed that Gayane was filmed after she was captured, tortured, and mutilated by the Azerbaijani military forces. They filmed the entire violent incident and posted on social media for 5 consecutive days. The video shows Gayane's body stripped naked, her chest exposed where the name of the Azerbaijani brigade written, her eyes gouged and replaced with stones, her legs cut off, her ears cut off, and her severed finger showed into her mouth as Azerbaijani soldier kicks her mutilated body. Gayane had 4 children at the time of her murder. Lala is here to say that her sister was not the only victim of atrocities committed by Azerbaijani forces towards Armenian women. Azerbaijan must be held accountable, otherwise they will be emboldened to continue committing violence with impunity. In 2023, Center for Truth and Justice published a report warning that all indicators point in one direction: the looming genocide of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. The report warned the United States and European Union that hate speech spouted by Ilham Aliyev and his administration had 2 goals: to remove all Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh by force, by starvation, or by killing, and use war and violence against the Republic of Armenia to invade and occupy the land. Both of these scenarios have tragically come true. Today, for the first time in history, Nagorno-Karabakh stands devoid of Armenians, and parts of Armenia remain occupied by Azerbaijani military forces. I urge the United States government and the international community to take decisive action and hold Azerbaijan accountable for crimes against humanity. We ask the United States to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all Armenian hostages and prisoners of war, and the right for indigenous Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh to return to their homes and lands. Thank you again for allowing me to present testimony today. Hearing the stories of the victims is one form of justice. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Krikorian. I would just note parenthetically that one of my great heroes in human rights has been Natan Sharansky, the great Jewish refugenik. And he made a very strong statement years ago, and I actually went to the camp where he was, Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains, back in the 1980s. He said, you cannot have accountability if you do not chronicle the abuse. And you are doing that, and you are gathering those testimonies, and that will have a huge impact going forward. And I can't thank you enough for that. And it has to be a very hard job to hear about the atrocities. I'd like to now ask Mr. Krikorian if he could.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith, Co-Chair Smith, Congressman Costa, Congressman Harris. Thank you very much. I would also even though she's not here, like to single out retiring Commission member Anna Eshu, who's retiring and, of course, is of Armenian descent, and we're very proud of her, and on a bipartisan level had actually even awarded her our George Deukmejian Award more than a few years ago, but we will be sad to see her leave, as I'm sure the Commission will also. I have, as Co-Chair Smith knows, some extensive written remarks. I will try to summarize them. After some introduction, they're focused along 10 recommendations or categories of recommendations and requests. The first one to foreshadow is the most modest, and that is to ask that the co-chairs of this commission, with the imprimatur of this commission, issue a statement on the ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, noting that it was not only the Aliyev regime in Turkey, but the Erdogan regime Aliyev regime in Azerbaijan, but also the Erdogan regime in Turkey with Russian complicity that led to these genocidal actions, and to call for very clearly the not just secure return of Armenians to their historic presence there, but also their free presence there, which they deserve. Second, again, on the more modest side, we have found that congressional visits to the region help immensely. They draw reactions from authoritarian leaders, but at the same time, the threats of violence go down when visits increase. This year, we have seen an increase not only in administration visits, but increasingly congressional visits. We want to give credit to current U.S. Ambassador current Ambassador Kivian for traveling, especially to the South, as Ambassador Tracy before her did. But waving the flag and having people travel there really does help save people's lives. Third, one of the most effective ways in curbing violence we have seen is the presence of the European Union monitors at certain points along the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They were recently joined by Canadian monitors. They're not a military presence, but they are there because sunshine often is not just the best disinfectant, but also the best way to stop and account for violations of Armenia's border and hopefully remove Azeris from occupied Armenian territory as well. This is not a new request. This request has been made for over a decade. It was made forcefully by many members of Congress as well after the 2016 four-day war because of the distortions of fact that Azerbaijan made in terms of what was going on and who was to blame. During the 2020 war, the disinformation rose to a whole new level. Fifth, there was a gross imbalance of U.S. military assistance to Azerbaijan prior to the 2020 war. We would like and ask that and point out that it's in the U.S. interest that that not only be corrected, but the United States support Armenia's military needs much more strenuously than it has. Sixth, somewhat related to that, Armenia is still currently listed as a Schedule D country by the Department of Commerce. A special license could be granted. The government, I know, has been willing to sign end-user agreements, agree to monitoring. Pending its upgrade from Schedule D, we think that Congress can help us persuade the Commerce Department to do that to save people's lives. Fifth, and I know that some of my colleagues on the panel have alluded to it, there are numerous laws on the books already that are just not being enforced. And again, the details are in my testimony, and I will come to the key ones. Eighth, with respect to COP29, we have some very specific requests. Ideally, we do not want a repeat of the Olympics in China. We do not want a repeat of the Olympics in Russia. We do not want, as a prior witness has recently written, a repeat of Hitler's 1936 Olympics. But we understand that countries are committed to attend COP29, and we have a number of specific recommendations that we'd like them to follow, the delegations, as they do that. And also, and I will try not to do this too often, Co-Chair Smith, but reminiscing to our old days during the Soviet Union when a United States delegation had no fear about showing up to these types of conferences and reading the names of political prisoners as a priority, even though it may not have been on the agenda. Because doing that in a host country or an international conference like that will make a difference. We have a range of these types of recommendations, including having no delegation stay at properties that have been taken from Armenians and converted into hotels and things. Ninth, and this last to get into the more longer-term recommendations, is some strategic thinking and reflection on history. Again, considering the time that I have, I will just make the point briefly. But looking back at what happened after World War I, when the United States was offered the mandate, but in a wave of isolationism rejected the mandate for then independent Armenia, we can see what an enormous mistake that was. It would have changed the history of the Cold War because the United States would have had the mandate, and more of that region would have been westernized, democratized. People would have been more free. Now we're at another one of these windows. And I don't have to tell you what's happened in Georgia. I don't have to tell you what's happening in the rest of the region. You are as knowledgeable about it, and more so than we are. But everybody can see it. Not repeating that mistake in the 21st century, which is becoming a common theme of not repeating 20th century mistakes in the 21st century, strikes us as paramount. And finally, 10th recommendation deals with legislation. And specifically, you'll see in the remarks, and I know I'm probably already going too long, but the submission of Rodney Dixon to your September 2023 hearing was truly offensive. In it, he said there was no chance of genocide, there was no chance of ethnic cleansing, essentially there was no blockade. He belittled the facts, he belittled this committee, much like that Turkish diplomat did a long time ago when we were still talking about genocide resolutions. Nothing happened. If anything happened, they deserve it. It turns out, and I've included this in my testimony along with the investigative journalist's report, that he was not an independent observer, as was advertised not only to this committee, but also to the congressional staffs with whom he met, but was a paid agent of Azerbaijan. And that kind of lying to a commission ought not to go without an answer. You know that I'm also a law professor. In the Genocide Convention, conspiracy to commit genocide is an offense. In the Genocide Convention, complicity in genocide is an offense. In the US implementing legislation, but we don't prosecute a lot of those because of jurisdictional issues. But in the U.S. implementing legislation, and the citations are in my testimony, we have a provision that says that they can be prosecuted criminally for acts occurring in the United States. That's not only an example of an action that should be taken by the Department of Justice and something that should be looked into by this Commission and Congress, but I think it's also an area which is, now I'm going to go back to where my remarks were going to begin, that we need to look at in terms of the new reality of the world dividing into authoritarian states and democracies, capitalism and communism, or not even communism anymore, but kleptocracies and command economies. We discussed this earlier. The WTO is a prime example of how the failure to recognize those differences has caused damage to the countries that play by the rules. The same is true for human rights treaties. Yes, Azerbaijan is a party to numerous human rights treaties. Do they abide by European Court of Human Rights rulings or any of the principles they signed up to? No. Will there be substantial greenwashing at this COP29? Yes. I know I'm not the first person to think of it, but I would like to put it directly before this commission and you as members of Congress that I think this commission could work on a new treaty-type arrangement among democracies, among free market economies, and separate the people who are willing to play by the right rules from the ones who don't. And I think both in terms of U.S. legislation, and again, I have concrete ideas, as well as a new treaty, which actually I spoke to the Tamil parliament in exile from Sri Lanka about their genocide, and that was when the thought first occurred to me, because we are not the only group. We are not the only group to suffer this way, you know, and we become desensitized because of what our families went through during the Armenian genocide, but also when we look back at the way Christian Armenians lived and other Christians lived during the Ottoman Empire, which was truly brutal, truly brutal. Things are going to change. It's going to be a long time to get them to change, but you have always been with us in starting these long journeys. You have been with us for all this time, and we appreciate it. Now I'll turn to my comments. I'll be brief. I think you got the gist of my points, but I especially want to thank you, Co-Chair Smith, Congressman Costa, Congressman Harris again, as well as your staffs who have always been excellent. We truly appreciate their work. We are displaying a poster exhibit, which I was happy Geram could refer to, and it has redacted pictures, including of one of the victims that Sharma mentioned, that show the patterns of behavior here. Again, we know your commission and you as individuals are fully aware of what's happened. If, as a lawyer, we were putting forward, and we have put forward, and your prior witnesses have put forward, and academics have put forward, all of the evidence of genocidal intent, all of the genocidal actions. We now have a situation where Aliyev and Erdogan are actually bragging about eliminating the entire Armenian presence and destroying churches and the whole cultural presence. When we were talking about the Armenian genocide and the situation of Armenians in Turkey, their destruction of our churches took place over a much longer period of time. Now it's happening on a fast-forward basis. This evidence of subsequent admissions is enormous. and should not give anyone pause, because usually in these genocide cases, the hardest element is intent. We have provided, not only on the posters, but also we have fact sheets with all the citations to the pre-2023 genocidal intent, and my testimony includes evidence on the post-2023 genocidal intent. The other point I'd like to make, or announcement I'd like to make, is that our Armenian National Institute, which you were kind enough to mention, also just opened a new website, which is academically oriented, but is of use to educators as well as to government officials, and we found people all over the world who, on the ethnic cleansing and destruction of Nagorno-Karabakh, the last chapter of the Armenian genocide. It's been vetted academically, and it's based on formal records attesting to the genocidal nature of the results. It includes links to the Caucasus Heritage Site. It includes links to the remarkable project that Professor David Phillips had led at Columbia University on the atrocities around the prior events, not 2023, but he's testified here twice during this congressional session, and you're familiar with his work there. I will make one last point, and I'm happy to cover the recommendations because, as usual, I'm talking too long. As usual, you're being polite and not stopping me, which I appreciate, but I understand. All of us in this room are familiar with that quote from Hitler about who today speaks of the extermination of the Armenians. That's actually exhibited in the Holocaust Museum here in Washington. What most people don't get to, though, is what he said before that. What he said before that was, anybody who speaks against me will be killed. Last Friday, I was speaking at the rededication of the Edwin Michaelian County Government Building in Westchester, New York. And I reflected on how my grandmother watched her whole family be massacred and then was put into slavery, from which she escaped. But my father's family was saved by a Turkish family. And one of the things that the Armenian Assembly, the Armenian National Institute, and really I'll say the global Armenian community feels it's our burden to do is to educate people on how important your choices in life are. And there's an educational aspect here too. Right now, the pains are still great for all of us. The Armenian prisoners who are friends and deserve to be out. The Armenian Prime Minister who, in December of 2022, and this is in my testimony, basically screamed out to the world, we are at risk of genocide. We need to help those people. We need to help them because we just see history repeating itself too often. This time I'll really stop and be happy to answer any questions. And thank you for accepting my testimony, the lengthier written testimony. And we have a redacted version. We have an unredacted version to the extent anybody wants to verify. We've redacted people's faces so their families aren't offended or distraught. But we'll put the posters also in our testimony if that's acceptable. Not the big ones, electronic version.
Thank you so much for that testimony, and it really was a learning experience. I've heard you before, but every time I learn something new, and I do thank you, we all thank you for the extensive knowledge you bring to bear, and above all, the wisdom you bring to bear. Before going to our very next distinguished witness, Dr. Harris does have to leave for a committee assignment, but I'd like to yield to Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the witnesses. I apologize in advance to Ms. Prasow. I'm not going to be able to hear your testimony, but I will read your written statement. You know, as some of you may know, I mean, I traveled with the Helsinki Commission, and we visited Armenia this July. We were on the border with Azerbaijan. We saw the encroachments. We heard the stories. We met with people who were I will use the term forcibly extracted from the NK region, because that's the way you have to describe it. I mean, the bottom line is they were left with no choice but to leave. There are two issues I want to bring up. One is I'm most disturbed by the destruction of what can best be described as cultural buildings. I mean, it was my first visit to the South Caucasus, and you know, if you go and visit the monasteries that are 1,000 years old, I mean, these are tremendous World Heritage sites that should be preserved and never destroyed. And I'm very bothered by the obvious evidence from the imagery you show that there's destruction going on for no good reason, really for no good reason. And that is something we have to deal with. But the other issue that makes it very difficult, and I'll have to think, and maybe with your help you'll make some suggestions, how do we deal with Turkey? Because I'll tell you a little anecdote. So my wife doesn't really like to fly, but she was with us on this congressional delegation as the spouses travel with the Helsinki Commission. And we were going to Malta from Yerevan. Now, if you look at a map and you draw a line from Yerevan to Malta, I'm like, it's not that long a flight. Don't worry. You go right over Turkey, or it's right there. We look out the airplane window, and all of a sudden, we're not flying over Turkey. We're flying over the Black Sea. And the next day, we asked the pilot, like, hey, how come we didn't go straight? Like, Turkey refused the airspace. Now, this is a NATO ally. We're traveling on a U.S. government airplane, and a NATO ally refused us airspace because we had visited Yerevan. We have to deal with that. I'm sorry, we simply have to deal with that. And that's on us. I mean, again, in the region, if you look at the last 70 years, Turkey has been our ally for those 70 years. No other country has. I mean, Russia hasn't, Georgia hasn't, Azerbaijan hasn't, Armenia hasn't, Turkey has been. And yet at this point in time, it seems that our most lengthy relationship with an ally is the one that is, in fact, I will use the term, betraying some of the trust we have in some of our allies to do the right thing. But we will deal with that, because increasingly it was clear that what happened with the NK region and what I'll call the extraction of Armenians from the region was complicity between the Russians, the Turks, and the Azerbaijanis. It's pretty clear. I mean, they all had a hand to play. It's pretty clear. And again, I'm going to have to apologize. I have to leave. I hope to revisit the region. I hope that I'm glad to hear that when we come to the region, it actually results in hopefully turning down the level of I could use the term violence, but I will say of the ability of our Azerbaijanis to exert influence that shouldn't be exerted in the region. And I would hope that our government takes a very strong position, looks at what happened. And now the records are in. We know what happened in 2020. We know what happened in 2022, 2023. We know what happened. The evidence is in. The evidence is clear that cultural heritage sites, especially the religious sites, are being destroyed for no good reason. And we shouldn't tolerate it. It's up to us to figure out how we solve that issue, but it is an issue that obviously does need to be solved, because we do need to stand against that kind of behavior. It's tricky, as you all know, difficult part of the world, a rough neighborhood. But again, I thank you all for your testimony here today. Again, bringing, in my case, for me, but of course the entire commission up to date on what is happening in that part of the world. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back, and I do have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for your comments and for your leadership.
Just,
You wanted to
just
say
briefly before you go, not only were you upset because they were an NATO ally and not giving you the airspace, they did that during the earthquake. And actually, the treaty that sets the border between Armenia and Turkey gives Armenia the right to free communication, transportation through Turkey, which Turkey has denied illegally since independence, basically. Sorry, but I knew you were leaving.
Thank you. Andrea, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I think it's technically still morning, so good morning. I want to thank you, Co-Chairman Smith, as well as Co-Chairman McGovern, members of this commission for this opportunity. My name is Andrea Prasso, and I'm the Executive Director of Freedom Now, an organization dedicated to protecting individuals and communities from government repression. For many years, Freedom Now has worked to assist human rights defenders in Azerbaijan and sought freedom for political prisoners there. However, today I am not here representing Freedom Now, but rather I will be reading a composite statement from human rights activists from Azerbaijan who so fear reprisal from their own government that they cannot attend today or even use their names. Today's testimony addresses recent developments in Azerbaijan and is drawn directly from the statements of individuals who have been targeted by the regime for their human rights activism. And I quote, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission, allow us to take this opportunity to state plainly and directly that the human rights situation in Azerbaijan is dire and getting worse. As you are well aware, Azerbaijan is an authoritarian regime that for over a decade has used its laws and its judicial system to steadily restrict and contain civil society. You would have great difficulty finding an activist, journalist, opposition politician, or NGO leader in Azerbaijan today who has not faced harassment by their own government. This is a situation to which Azerbaijanis have become accustomed. However, in the last 2 years, the situation has deteriorated greatly, beyond anything we have experienced in recent memory. At this moment, there are more than 300 political prisoners in Azerbaijan, many of them jailed since December 2022. Many of them are our friends and colleagues. One of those imprisoned is Ulvi Hasanli, a journalist who has been the director of the independent news outlet Absas Media since 2016. In November 2023, masked men arrested Ulvi outside his home, beating him in the process. In addition to Hasanli, other journalists of Absas Media, as well as its chief editor, Sevinch Bagevkizi, have also been arrested for their coverage of sensitive political topics and criticism of the government. Then in March 2024, police raided the offices of Toplam TV and IDI, the Institute of Democratic Initiatives, a nonprofit organization, and arrested dozens of people, including 3 journalists, co-founder of Toplam TV, Alizgar Mamadli, and founder of IDI and human rights defender, Akif Gurbanov. Within a period of 4 months, 3 independent news outlets and 1 NGO were effectively shut down. These arrests are yet another chapter in Azerbaijan's continued campaign against independent journalists. It became increasingly difficult for all journalists to operate when the government adopted a new media law in early 2022. The law requires journalists to register with a government-controlled agency and allows the government to bar journalists from accreditation if they have a criminal record, something the members of Absas Media and Toplam TV will all undoubtedly have once their politically motivated trials come to the predetermined conclusion. Azerbaijan has accelerated its repression as we draw closer to its hosting of the UN Climate Conference, known as COP29, in November. Amidst rumors that President Aliyev will announce a lasting peace deal with Armenia over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, several peace activists have been arrested and charged with treason. Among them are Baruz Samarov, a researcher completing his doctoral studies in Prague. Baruz is a prolific commentator and contributor to a wide range of international publications, including the BBC and RFE-RL, where he spoke out against Azerbaijan's military operations. He was arrested on August 21st, 2024, and held incommunicado for 2 days before the government confirmed his detention. While in prison, detainees are facing life-threatening conditions. During the first 6 months of 2024, Ulvi Hasanli documented 58 instances of torture and inhumane treatment in the facility in which he is being kept. These are only the cases he personally witnessed. In one incident, Ulvi heard a prisoner plead with a guard to stop beating him. The guard replied, "I became the first deputy by beating prisoners." These prison officials can operate with impunity as they know prisoners have no effective means to report this mistreatment. Ulvi even describes prisoners being beaten under signs for the National Anti-Torture Hotline. To protest these conditions, some prisoners have taken drastic measures. For example, academic Vasil Gasimov has been on a hunger strike for more than 90 days, his health rapidly deteriorating. These are just a few examples of Azerbaijan's ever-expanding repression. There are hundreds more. Stories not just of political imprisonment, but of harassment of LGBTQ individuals, of lack of support for domestic violence victims, of discrimination against religious groups. The list goes on and on. Since this crackdown began, we have seen the US and its Western partners take a more stringent approach to Azerbaijan, for which we are grateful. But so far, these actions have not impeded Aliyev's regime. More serious actions must be taken in order to compel Azerbaijan to release political prisoners and relax its grip on civil society. This includes targeted sanctions against human rights abusers in the government and conditioning certain areas of foreign assistance on measurable human rights improvements. Otherwise, we fear more of our friends will see the inside of a prison. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much for all of this very important, timely, actionable information that we need to do far more than we have done. You mentioned before, Ms. Waters, about the is Maliova, about her case, the Radio Free Europe journalist. I put together a hearing. We had the editor-in-chief of RFL come and testify because she had gotten an over 7-year prison sentence for what? Exposing the corruption of Aliyev himself. Now, she was a indigenous, she was not an Armenian. She was a Azerbaijani woman, very bold, very effective, an aggressive journalist, and for that she was harshly punished. Well, she got released, but and we made the point she's working for an American organization, a government organization called RFL and Radio Liberty, but that's it's just indicative of the tip of the iceberg of just how barbaric Aliyev is. He couldn't take being exposed for the corruption that he is very much a part of, including his family, and certainly both you and others have. Andrea just talked about the use of torture. We need to do far more on that. To think that people will be flocking again to Azerbaijan to talk about climate change. Go to Paris. Go to some place where there's freedom. Don't go to Baku. And what troubles me so deeply is that as that's happening, people will be suffering torture. I've written 4 laws, not bills, laws on torture, called the Torture Victims Relief Act. And I have learned so much over the years about the PTSD that is suffered by torture victims. We've had them testify. Yes, there's a great deal that can be done to mitigate that psychologically, but it never goes away. The beatings, the solitary confinement, the extreme claustrophobia, the use of psychotic or psychiatric psychotropic drugs, all those things combined, and they're using it right now in Azerbaijan. So that makes Aliyev the torturer-in-chief of not only Armenians and POWs and others, but also his own people. They're not his people. The people of Azerbaijan deserve better than a dictator that the world looks askance in terms of raising the issue. So I thank you all. I mean, you've given us so much to act upon, timely, especially with the upcoming summit, and we need to do far more. I love the idea of reading the names. I thought that was really, really important that you suggested that. I remember talking, again, not to bring Sharansky back into it, but his senator from, and became the foreign minister of Canada, and his daughter is actually the anti-Semitic leader in Israel in combating anti-Semitism. And she told me the story about how Gorbachev once said, "Why does everybody keep raising, and you especially, Sharansky?" He goes, "I'm just going to let him go," because every time he turned around, names were being used. And it was mentioned earlier about Reagan. Schultz, every time he went to the Soviet Union, I went many times on behalf of persecuted believers, as well as Jewish refuseniks, always had a list, always brought it up with our interlocutors who hated it. But one by one, not all, many of those got out of prison camps and were escaped the torture of that dictatorship. So at this summit, there needs to be a reading. Hopefully the U.S. delegation will do that. And maybe impolite. Who cares? Look what's happening, in these jails, to the beatings, as you mentioned just a moment ago, as this journalist was arrested. That's what they do. And they do it with such impunity. So we have to raise our voices far more than we have. I do have some questions, but I don't want to keep you too much longer. But you've all made so many good recommendations that we just need to act upon, and I can't thank you enough for that. When you mentioned, Mr. Smith, Professor Smith, about, let me just find your quote. I had it right here a moment ago. The U.S., including us, have not yet responded to Azerbaijan's policy of cultural erasure, which began in 1997. Shame on us. And that's both parties, both White Houses, no matter who's in charge. Why aren't we raising this the way we should? So I think your point was extremely well taken. And you heard Dr. Harris saying how shocked he was to see this erasure that's happening in real time. So thank you for that. It's not unlike what the Erdogan and others have done to the Cyprus churches, the churches in Cyprus. So we just need to keep raising our voices. And we're going to act on your recommendations. There are just so many of them and so well thought out. But I'd like to ask if there's anything else you would like to add, because you just covered things so comprehensively. From left to right, right to left, however you want to do it.
Sure. I think the only thing I would add is that the relationship between the obliteration of cultural heritage and the obliteration of a people is very succinctly expressed in a publication that came out when our initial findings regarding Azerbaijan's erasure of cultural heritage in Nakhchivan. This was published in the Art newspaper. It was an initial foray into that satellite-based investigation. And the reply of the Azerbaijani ambassador to England was that there could not have been any cultural erasure because Armenians have never lived in this place. There is a direct feeding chain between the erasure of heritage, the erasure of a people, and ultimately then the erasure of the crime. No heritage, no people, no crime. This is all part of a process of criminality and then the erasure of that, the cover-up of that criminality. I agree with you also, not only that the U.S. was not vocal enough between 1997 and 2011 when this erasure was happening, but also the international organizations that are supposed to be watchdogs for cultural heritage. And here I think we should single out UNESCO for particular critique, because not only was there no response to clear emerging evidence from places like Nakhchivan, that the Azerbaijani government was engaged in a process of systematic erasure, but that they also began to woo Azerbaijani officials. There was large amounts of money that were given to UNESCO by Azerbaijan. The World Heritage Commission meeting was held in Baku after this was happened, and the First Lady of Azerbaijan was given UNESCO's highest medal, the Mozart Medal. So I think that we need to not only be scrupulous in looking at what we need to do better as Americans, but also hold to account the international organizations that are supposed to be our watchdogs.
Thank you.
Just because it is an opportunity and not to take too long again, but it is beyond frustrating that the United States has not placed sanctions on individuals who have clearly committed atrocities. They have the evidence, and in some of these cases, not only and in the posters, but also in other documentary evidence we've given, of Azeris making trophy videos of beheading Armenians, holding up the heads, and then getting medals from Aliyev. We have the case that my colleague Sharma discussed, their trophy video of brutally mutilating the female soldier. And then, you know, as a token, Aliyev saying, oh, we're gonna review it and punish these people. Well, they said they were bringing charges against 4 people, but before you knew it, the charges were dropped when they thought nobody was paying attention, and 1, maybe 2 of them received medals also from their government for defending their borders. It's totally untrue. For the United States, you know, I'll say administration, to turn a blind for all the crimes that were committed, bing, bang, boom, they gave them 15 years. There's more, but I know time is short, and I will rely on my written testimony where I have additional accounts. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I will briefly take the opportunity to speak as myself, the Executive Director of Freedom Now, rather than the activist whose words I was channeling earlier. I really appreciate the commitment to seek to have the names of political prisoners read out loud at COP. I think that's a wonderful idea. I thank my colleague for that. But I also really appreciated your commitment to writing a congressional letter in advance of COP, and would urge you to put as much pressure as possible in advance of COP29 on Azerbaijan to release political prisoners. Once the event begins, the incentive that they may have, I think, is significantly reduced. So the coming nearly 2 months are the best opportunity for all diplomatic efforts by the United States and others to urge Azerbaijan to release political prisoners, so that COP will be an opportunity to focus on the true environmental crisis and not on their atrocious human rights record.
Excellent.
Thank you.
We'll do it. We'll do it right away. I appreciate that. Let me just ask, you know, I remember running into the ambassador of Azerbaijan right outside in the hallway and got talking to him, and about 3 paragraphs into the conversation, he said, I got to call Podesta, who was his government affairs guy here in Washington. And it was like, you know, because I was asking some very hard questions. I would say to those who represent Azerbaijan and do their bidding, shame on you. We've had that happen for dictatorships all over the world. Very, very large amounts of money are conveyed to these shops here in D.C., particularly on K Street, who then put together all kinds of talking points and narratives that are extremely false and misleading. I cut my eye teeth on that during the Romania problem with with Ceausescu. I introduced legislation in the early 1980s to take away MFN from Ceausescu because of what he was doing to Christians in particular, in terms of incarceration and torture with his secret police known as the Securitate. All of a sudden, we had a deluge of paid lobbyists who would descend upon the House and Senate and I met with them too and argued with them with these just polished talking points about how great Ceausescu is. Anybody saying that now? Nobody. He was a monster. And he was known for his use of torture. Father Cauchu and so many others who suffered so much were testimony to that. So, and we did finally get rid, and it was a bipartisan thing. Tony Hall, Frank Wolf, and I led the effort, and we did, you know, Romania did fall, and Ceausescu as well. My hope is that we put the pressure on now as never before on Aliyev. And you're right, Andrea, that this is an opportune time. When he was coming to D.C. for a summit during the Obama administration, I had introduced the bill calling for the release of political prisoners and made a big deal about it with press conferences, and a lot of them got out. But then they went right back, reverted right back to form as soon as the summit was over. And so we've got to get our administrations to be consistent and say, they not only get out, they don't go back in. It's not recidivism, as we know, where you just revolving door back into the jail. But you've got to change, and if we don't do that, his dictatorship will continue to flourish. So so we're going to work on all of your recommendations. I can't say. I would also say, I introduced in 2004 the legislation to go after Belarus. Called the Belarus Democracy Act. It became law. My bill became law. And in that case, Lukashenko learned that he couldn't get, and about 200 of his top people, visas to come here, and they couldn't do business here. And many political prisoners got out. That morphed into Global Magnitsky and the Magnitsky Act itself vis-a-vis Russia. So what I'm saying is that model, we've got the Global Magnitsky Act sitting right there on the shelf. Apply it to these people who are doing horrific things to Armenians as well as to their own people in Azerbaijan. I also believe we need to very seriously pursue a war crimes tribunal. The ICC needs to step up. It needs to go after these crimes and to do it and not to look the other way. We have not ratified the ICC, but it's got a lot to recommend it in all candor. Why don't they do it? This is a time when they need to step up and do it, and they have not done it. We had the former prosecutor give outstanding testimony, as you all know, but we want the current prosecutor to begin leveling charges against Aliyev, and I would say Erdogan as well, because he is absolutely complicit. We also need to look, if that doesn't work, at a hybrid court. I'm very close to David Crane and many of the others that were involved with the Court of Sierra Leone. I know that Milosevic and all those others, I was very involved with that war in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia and in Croatia. They never thought for a moment that a criminal court proceeding could proceed against them. I met with Bashir in Sudan. And all he wanted to do is get off the sanctions list and get this indictment lifted. So it does have an impact. Hybrid courts do work. They're not perfect, but as David Crane will tell you, another chief prosecutor of the Sierra Leone court, it is a way of very narrowly focusing on someone. There needs to be a court, or at least an attempt to hold him to account for all of this and his cronies. So a lot of tools, they're not being used. And so I give the final word again to anyone else who would like to just conclude. But you've been so patient with your time, and thank you for your expertise. Anybody else like to? Thank you. The hearing is adjourned, and I appreciate it. All members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend. And again, so appreciate your testimonies.